Who should I be looking at when I?
Me.
Okay.
Okay. I'm ready. We'll start with the usual identification.
Okay. So, if you could just say your name and then spell.
I need to over.
Oh, okay. You could say your name and the name of your business, and I'll spell your name as well. This is going to be helpful when we're cataloging.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah, you're fine.
My name is Amber Lamke, A-M-B-E-R, last name L-A-M-B-K-E. I run Maine Grains Gristmill in downtown Skowhegan, and I was a co-founder of the annual kneading conference.
I neglected to bring release form for you to sign.
Okay.
So we'd like to get it orally, your permission to be in a documentary called Brain Changers, and in promotional footage that we might circulate to promote the film.
I grant permission to use my interview in a documentary film called The Grain Changers and any promotional materials that go with it.
Thank you. Are we ready? Oh, yeah, we're okay. All right. So I'd like you to start with some biographical information about yourself and about how you got into being interested in grains.
Mm-hmm. So I moved to this rural community of Skowhegan, Maine in 2001 as a practicing speech and language pathologist. But I became involved in my community's intensive efforts to revitalize the downtown and create jobs here that had been lost due to a lost paper industry and the need for employment here. That started with a lot of volunteer efforts to grow a farmer's market here, and it put me in touch with what was happening with agriculture. Through the eyes of the farmer's market, it helped me realize that there is a rich agricultural history here and affordable farmland. We live in a climate here in Maine that has access to water, has strong advocacy support for organic agriculture, and we're in a setting where organic dairy farms here were well positioned to grow grains. Good friends of ours are the Barden family, who own Maine Wood Heat. And at the urging of Albie Barden, I helped him to start the first kneading conference in 2007. The goal at that time was really just to start conversations between oven builders, grain growers, bread bakers, millers, and try to figure out why we didn't have more grains to contribute to the local foods movement here. Albie Barden from Maine Wood Heat was building wood-fired bake ovens for bakers in Maine that wanted more access to local grains for good bread. So in 2007, in about 6 months' time, there's Albie, right on cue.
Is that Albie?
Yeah.
Oh, he's going to lift the oven.
Yeah.
Here.
Well, you can still work it in between.
We can work a little bit in between.
Okay. So in 2007, we started the first kneading conference, and it was a gathering of about 75 people, all that we invited to simply start conversations about what was possible here in Maine, to grow grain for good bread and beer and to feed people. Interestingly, at that time, Maine was already focused, thanks to some efforts at the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. There was some focus on revitalizing grain growing on organic dairy farms to be able to provide resources like straw for animal bedding that would meet the organic standards necessary on organic dairy farms and save the farmer costs. So there were some early efforts to grow grain on organic dairy farms, and we piggybacked on those discussions to broaden the conversations out to include bread and to include milling. We quickly learned in 2007 that we grew an abundance of grain in the Northeast. at one time. So my county alone here in Maine in the mid 1830s grew about 239,000 bushels of wheat. So that was enough to feed over 100,000 people in a county that now is only about 50,000 people. I'll pause while he moves the forklift again.
So, I don't know if we'll end up being wanting to use it, but why dairy farmers?
Mm-hmm. So here in Skowhegan, we're in the center of the state, and we're in the densest belt of organic dairy farms in the state. So that is part of our agricultural industry here. And grains were becoming part of the conversation about how to run an economically viable dairy farm, because the straw inputs needed on the farm were something that were increasingly being purchased from outside the state. So the University of Maine Cooperative Extension had some early focus on how to teach organic dairy farmers how to grow their own straw via grains.
And we'll go ahead and wait. You got enough in?
Yep.
We're going to have lack of continuity when we have some of that background sound.
Go.
Okay.
Why dairy farms? First Kneading Conference. Okay, I'm just going to pick up with our very first Kneading Conference in 2007. We were addressing the most basic of questions, like, can we grow grains in Maine? And it was really that first conference that of connecting people that helped us realize that, of course, we grew grains here, and we can do it again. And it was the coming together that helped us start asking different questions. How do we grow grains here again? Who still knows how to do it, and where are they? What are farmers in Maine doing right now? We didn't know. And it set us on a path to create an annual event, but also an annual set of activities to rebuild Maine's grain economy.
So what role did you play in stimulating farmers growing grains?
In the early years, I was just a volunteer organizer to help organize the first Kneading Conference. Very quickly, our efforts became a year-round effort, and we were being asked to participate in more and more conversations about spurring the revival of a grain economy in Maine. So beyond the Kneading Conference and Bread Fair, we were being asked to teach year-round workshops on what we were doing and educating about the use of local grain and bread. We were being asked to provide technical assistance to grain-based businesses in Maine. And we also came to understand the role that needed to be played to grow out small quantities of rare and heritage varieties of seed to be larger so that we could reach commercial scale with some of these special grains. So I was a volunteer organizer. I became a co-founder of the conference, and then later the nonprofit organization that would hold all of these activities. I was the first part-time paid executive director of the Maine Grain Alliance. I'm going to pause there for a second since he's moving. Okay.
So you were essentially the founding director of the
Yes.
Maine Grain Alliance?
Yeah.
And what was the purpose of the Maine Grain Alliance?
The purpose of the Maine Grain Alliance was to restore grain traditions from earth to hearth. We cared about how to grow grains sustainably in Maine. We cared about how to process them, how to build a cluster of people and trades and knowledge around having a thriving grain economy in Maine that resulted in delicious food on our tables.
Can you say more about the farmers and their level of knowledge and what you contributed to helping farmers get up to speed as grain growers?
Mm-hmm. Around 2007, we had a few farmers in Maine that were growing grain and figuring out how to make food-grade grains possible. There were still missing pieces of infrastructure to clean grains appropriately, to take weed seeds out and make sure that we could deliver high-quality grains to bakers. We also lacked any machinery in Maine in the early 2000s to take hulls off of oats or off of spelt in order to make them a food grade product. We've long grown grains in Maine as a rotation crop. So with our potato industry, for example, oats and rye have been a historic rotation crop, but had been underutilized for food. They'd either been tilled under or not harvested at all for the food grade benefit of those things because of the lack of infrastructure. We soon realized that if we were going to effectively rebuild a viable grain economy in Maine, we would need to build more infrastructure.
Could you say a little bit about what that infrastructure is?
So here in Skowhegan, we're in the center part of the state. There's a small mill that operates in the northern part of the state. Here in central Maine and Skowhegan, we realized that we needed the equipment to clean, dehull, mill, flake, pearl grains to make them food grade to service the farmers in our area. Maine is a very big state, and so it is 3.5 to 5 hours to some of the farms north of us in Skowhegan. So it didn't make much sense for farms in central Maine to grow grains that were trucked 4 hours north for processing to turn around and come back to the markets south of Maine. So I set about in pretty much right after the first kneading conference, I set about learning everything I could about milling to try to figure out how we could get infrastructure solved in the center of the state. I didn't initially think that would be me to start a mill, but ultimately it was a business partner and myself that put the plans together to start a mill here in Skowhegan.
And who were you serving then, and who are you serving now?
The mill aims to serve our organic farms in Maine and in central Maine. Our market base here in Maine is really the Northeast. We look at the markets that want freshly milled local grains as being the bakers, brewers, and chefs between Maine and New York City. Lots of mouths to feed between where we live and New York City. There's about 1 million people in Maine and many million in Manhattan. So we set about looking at a regional system. Grains really need to be thought of as a regional crop. Not everybody, unlike lettuce, not everybody's going to have a grain crop in their backyard or on a small scale diversified farm. The infrastructure to appropriately handle, both from planting to harvest to drying to storage, to be able to handle grains is large and expensive equipment in some cases. So we need to think about that as a regional resource. So we started cooperating quite broadly, not only in Maine, but also throughout the Northeast in our efforts.
What obstacles or challenges have you faced that you've either managed or not to overcome in your efforts to develop this?
There are so many obstacles, but there's so much we can do every single day to keep making forward progress. So I think our success here in Maine has been built on tackling the pinch point of today and trying to make progress, find appropriate solutions, and then moving on to the next pinch point in the system. We've always talked about
Is that the right thing to do?
Yeah, that's fine. Picking up with, we've always talked about.
Yep.
Yeah.
We've thought about our efforts here in Maine as being a cluster. Grains is really a clustered economy. So by that we mean that it takes so many parts to make for a successful grain economy. It takes farmers that know how to grow grains. It takes millers that know how to process the grains. It takes bakers that know how to work with them. And so if you think about it as a cluster, every time we find a new partner to round out our knowledge and help advance what we're doing, we find another piece of the cluster that we can work on or that emerges. So in the last 13 years of running the conference and the last 7 years of running our mill, we find that the network just keeps increasing. It keeps deepening and filling out, if you will. So the grain chain involves more than just bakers and brewers now. It involves maltsters. It involves compost companies that can use the byproducts and chaffy hulls that come from dehulling grains. It involves mushroom growers that use that material as a medium to grow mushrooms. It involves the livestock producers that need bedding or feed for animals. And increasingly, we will learn about more. There are companies in Maine that are trying to figure out how to press nutritious oils out of some of the chaffy byproducts of grains. There's more and more we can be thinking about. So for us, that's an exciting framework to keep thinking about where the opportunities are in grains. There's many challenges, and I think we can't get overwhelmed by the challenges, whether it's financial or whether it's knowledge base. Maybe we didn't know enough to prevent mistakes in this particular year, but now we know not to repeat them next year. Or it just takes a lot of sharing and patience and time. So,
can you be a little philosophical now and say a bit about your perspective on how what you guys have been doing fits into a larger frame, a larger movement, either about localism or about grain chains happening elsewhere and how you're connecting. So it's both philosophical and practical.
Yeah.
A movement.
The early conversations to try to restore a grain economy in Maine were as much about building resources and resilience here locally as it was about creating a model that could be replicated or shared by others. We knew early on that we were not interested in franchising, if you will, or advising on efforts everywhere. But we did want to show that this model of reconnecting with each other at the community level to create the resources that are necessary for vibrancy is possible everywhere. It's really inspiring to see pockets of grain connection happening all over the world right now. And so we see it happening not only in the United States, but in other countries. And the efforts are small, but they're important for rebuilding cultural assets, healthy food, happy people. Pause there for a second and just recollect my thoughts.
Can you say more about cultural assets?
Yep.
What do you mean by that?
I think it was Klaus Martin in New York who was quoted as saying, "We all do better when we all do better." And I love remembering that. I feel like our agricultural system has developed to a scale that is undeniably causing harm to our health and our environment. But there is an opportunity for us to change, and we can all do better when we all do better. So I think by focusing on what we can tangibly fix at the community level, we create much broader change that ripples outward from our communities. We know we're creating healthier food when we're creating freshly milled whole grain flours. We know we're eating better when we have bakers in our communities that know how to make delicious things out of those grains. And I think increasingly I'm inspired by the fermentation and the microbes that are part of this movement that we know are making us healthier and smarter and happier, right down to the microscopic level. So many of the grain leaders that we now learn from, who are the best examples of organic farmers or millers of organic grains, used to be conventional farmers. So I'm inspired and open to the idea that we've been practicing grain production in ways that may not be healthy, but that can be changed. And our leaders now have simply chosen a different path. And we need to make room for all of us to learn how to do better.
You know who Bob Quinn is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I interviewed him last week, and he used to be a conventional grower,
Mm-hmm.
and now he's an organic grower.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a really inspiring guy. I think somebody's coming through.
Okay.
Let's see what happens. Actually, that I just wanted to mention Bob Quinn because what he's doing is obviously influencing a lot of people with his trademark and all. But the wheat that he grows and the people who are inspired by him, it's pretty broad.
Mm-hmm.
You were at the Landrace conference.
I
Yeah.
was, so I got to meet him there,
Yeah.
and you know, I just feel like change is motivated by so many different things. We don't need to judge.
No.
We just need to focus on the solutions that feel better,
Yeah.
and we'll make mistakes, and we'll have some wins.
So just to wrap up,
Mm-hmm.
are you a baker? What are your favorite personal uses of grains and flour in your own life?
I'm in all of this that has started and been created through the Maine Grain Alliance. I now am a miller. I now run a mill. I'm a hobbyist baker. I don't consider myself a great baker, but we do run a little cafe out of our mill now where we're trying to showcase what grains can taste like in an everyday menu. And so I do pitch in the kitchen now and again to bake things like scones and pies, and I love that part of it. I also really appreciate the excellent breads that are coming from the artisan bakers in our network, because that's not in my repertoire.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, that's a wrap. Thanks so
Okay,
much.
great.
Really
Yeah, you're
appreciate
welcome.
it.